Well, the Supreme Court is expected to pronounce its verdict on the Indian Premier League fixing case in a short while from now. The focus is all on one point. Can Srinivasan contest the much-delayed BCCI elections? The Supreme Court had postponed BCCI's annual general meeting to the end of January. This was to seek more clarification if Srinivasan, who's under the scanner for his conflict of interest, can stand for that post or not. But the drama is not expected to end right there. The Supreme Court could even pass an order on Srinivasan's IPL franchise, the Chennai Super Kings. There could also be a verdict on the other three who've been named in the Mudgal panel report. Srinivasan's son-in-law, Gurunath Mayappan's alleged involvement with bettors could land the franchise and, of course, himself in trouble. The Supreme Court could also scrap BCCI's new amendment in its constitution, which was brought into force in February 2008. This contentious clause allows BCCI officials to have a commercial interest in the IPL. The fate of Raj Kundra and IPL COO Sundaraman could also be sealed in today's verdict. The biggest of them, of course, is whether the Supreme Court will reveal the 8 individuals who've been named in the second report. These are the players who were involved in the scandal. And finally, reports suggest that due to lack of evidence on several points, the Supreme Court could also pronounce a new investigating committee to take the matter forward. So after today's hearing and adjournments by the court, an order could finally be passed. If nothing else, at least one thing is guaranteed, that BCCI's annual general meeting issue, when that will be held and whether or not Srinivasan can participate in that election, that's one question that we can expect the Supreme Court to answer in its verdict, which is expected in a short while from now. It's after 17 months of hearings and investigations into the role of BCCI officials, the Supreme Court is finally expected to pass that order today. Coming to Shivani first, who's joining us live from outside the Supreme Court. Shivani, we believe the order is expected in a short while from now. Have you spoken to any of the legal experts, as we understand that at least one issue we can expect to be addressed by the Supreme Court for sure today? There is a lot of speculation on whether or not the other issues will be addressed, but we could know today whether or not Srinivasan will be allowed to contest that election.
That's right. We are expecting that order to be released any minute now. As far as just what we can expect, of course, the BCCI side is very unwilling to come on record, on its expectations. They, of course, have pleaded in front of the court that Srinivasan has nothing to hide. There is no allegation against him because he was cleared by the Mudgal panel of any wrongdoing as far as fixing and betting are concerned. But the larger question of conflict of interest, as much as the BCCI has tried to avoid it in hearings, did come to the fore and became the point that Srinivasan and BCCI were pinned down on. So on that regard, because the BCCI elections have been postponed by as much as 4 months already, remember they were supposed to be held in the end of September and now we are in January. So these much delayed elections cannot be delayed anymore. After the last hearing, we are expecting that now when the order comes, at least one point will be cleared. That is whether the Supreme Court feels Srinivasan's conflict of interest is big enough to keep him from fighting elections. Remember, during the hearings, the Supreme Court had even gone ahead to say that Srinivasan should choose amongst the two, whether he wants to be in the BCCI or wants to own an IPL team. The other contentious issue which is related to Srinivasan and his conflict of interest, in fact was the root of the conflict of interest, was the amendment to the clause 6.2.4 which allowed all of this to happen. So if we expect an adverse verdict for Srinivasan, one can expect an adverse verdict for this amendment as well, and that overall could be a landmark judgment because so far the BCCI has conducted itself as a private body. It hasn't come under scrutiny even from the Supreme Court, and this could become a landmark judgment. Of course, we cannot speculate exactly what the Supreme Court will do, but apart from these two, there is no guarantee whether the Supreme Court will pronounce orders on whether, on Chennai Super Kings, whether it should be allowed to go ahead and participate, on Mayappan, on IPL COO Sundaraman. Of course, Mayappan and Raj Kundra's role are more criminal in nature because there is betting and alleged fixing involved because he had team information. But the more impact of this judgment, at least today, will be felt on BCCI and its inner workings overall.
Absolutely. We can expect this verdict on the conflict of interest issue to have huge ramifications on the sport, on Indian Premier League. But Boria, speaking just about Srinivasan, if this issue is addressed by the Supreme Court today, it is going to have a domino effect on the several other cases as well. But for Srinivasan personally, how important is today's verdict?
Massive. I mean, before I answer that, let me just answer what you asked Shivani about the legal experts. Nalini Chidambaram, the petitioner's lawyer, is actually on her way to the Supreme Court. Spoke to her a while ago. She's just landed from Chennai, and so maybe in another half an hour they will reach the Supreme Court, the petitioner's side of the legal experts. Coming to Srinivasan, this is massive. I mean, his ICC future, his BCCI future, his future as an Indian cricket administrator, maybe even TNCA, depends on all of this. His entire clout in Indian cricket ranks, in Indian cricket administration, depends on what happens today. Can he contest? Can he not? Can he retain Chennai Super Kings? Can he not? What will the court say about conflict of interest? Will 6.2.4 be struck down? And I think Shivani made a very, very important point there. After today, is the BCCI a private body or is it a public body disbursing public functions?
Right.
Can it couch itself under this whole argument that we are a private body? If the Supreme Court arbitrates and says that your constitution is faulty, this amendment cannot hold good, the Supreme Court is telling the BCCI you're a public body disbursing public functions. That, I think, will have a landmark effect on Indian cricket, not today, not for Srinivasan, but for all times to come in the future.
Absolutely. Rasesh, coming to you, taking forward from what Shivani had said, that if the conflict of interest issue is addressed convincingly and really leaving no room for doubt by the Supreme Court today, we can expect it to have a ramification on other teams as well. Give us a lowdown really of what is the possible impact on other teams of today's verdict.
That question for me?
Rasesh, if you can hear me.
Yes, I can. You know, there are a number of other stakeholders of Indian cricket, of the IPL as well, who are as interested in his verdict as Mr. N. Srinivasan is. Remember, there are two franchises in question who would be looking at this order very, very closely: Chennai Super Kings and Rajasthan Royals. Chennai Super Kings, of course, owned by India Cements, whose MD is N. Srinivasan, and Rajasthan Royals, of course, is a consortium of partners, one of whom is Raj Kundra, whose role has been investigated by Justice Woodhull Committee and was discussed during the course of the hearing. What happens to these franchises? In an extreme case scenario, would the Supreme Court, based on the findings, be looking at one of the operational rules of the IPL, where it says if the reputation of the league is tarnished, that those franchises can be dismissed? Would that extreme steps be taken? Unlikely, but again, we do not want to preempt an order. You know, that is also something that cannot be ruled out.
Absolutely.
That would be massive, because the brand IPL then gets affected if the apex court takes such a situation. Even if the Supreme Court decides to ask Srinivasan to choose between CSK and the BCCI, that is in itself quite massive, because that may lead to a situation where India Cements may have to relinquish its control over the CSK, and then perhaps possibly a new owner coming in. That is also massive in itself, because that is again a position that the Supreme Court would be compelling Mr. Srinivasan to take, where conveniently the argument all along has been that he hasn't done nothing wrong. So I think there are a lot of implications, a lot of stakeholders who are interested parties in this, every franchisee of the IPL, and of course those for and against Srinivasan within the BCCI, the politicians who are part of this setup as well. Everyone would be looking at this order very, very closely.
Absolutely. Shivani, the Mughal panel had submitted two reports to the Supreme Court, one that dealt with their investigations into the players, and the other that dealt into the investigation against the officials. That is a report really that has been taken up and tackled first by the Supreme Court. Is it likely that the players who have not been named, will they be named? Is there speculation that the Supreme Court could also delve into the second report?
Actually, the two reports that the Mughal panel submitted were not separate for players and officials. One was an interim report which included the questions of match fixing and betting, and the second was a final report after more depositions were made. But you raised a very important question about what happens to the 9 players. 13 individuals were named in the sealed almanach that was submitted with the interim report in September. What happens to the other 9 names which weren't revealed? Those are names of players. Now, as far I've been covering these hearings ever since the final report was submitted, and the Supreme Court said in one of those hearings that we want to deal with the non-players first. We want to deal with the officials first. Let us get that out of the way, and then we will come to the players. But in the subsequent hearings, it almost seemed like the players in all of this had been forgotten. So it will be very, very crucial and important to note today whether the matter ends here or the Supreme Court goes further and schedules more hearings on the role of the players, because that hasn't come up for hearing at all so far. But right now the focus is on the non-players, the officials. But important question will be, how will the matter of the players' names be taken forward? Will there be another panel set up for it? Will the Mulgar panel be asked to take it further? Will there be hearings scheduled? Will the players be called? Will the names be revealed? All of that is not quite certain right now, Avral.
Absolutely. Bore, coming to you to what the BCCI really has put forth before the court so far. In the last hearing that took place, the court had observed that heavens will not fall if cricket administrators don't own IPL team. That gave us an inkling of what really the court is thinking at this point in time, but not, of course, trying to preempt the order here. What has really been the BCCI's representation before the Supreme Court so far? What has that argument been?
You've asked me 2 questions there. One, what is the BCCI's representation, and what, basically the court's thinking is. The BCCI's representation is simple, that Mr. Srinivasan is clean. It is time to stand behind him, not only Mr. Srinivasan, Sundaraman as well, and all the other officials named in the inquiry. The BCCI has steadfastly, sort of backed them. As you can see, the BCCI has taken no remedial measures despite all the observations passed by the Supreme Court. So the BCCI stand is very, very clear. And the BCCI lawyer and Mr. Srinivasan's lawyer, Kapil Sibal, went and argued that Mr. Srinivasan did not directly ever benefit from the conflict of interest, to which it was pointed out that one point in time, 13 crores were disbursed to the Chennai Super Kings when Mr. Srinivasan was actually treasurer and signatory. So there is direct benefit to Mr. Srinivasan. So the BCCI stand is clear. My officials, our officials are clean. Let them contest. We will probe this matter further. Whoever is guilty, we will punish. Court has never bought that argument. The court has said you are presiding over the demolition of Indian cricket. The court has said fans' faith need to be restored. Ultimately, it's about fans' faith. They are making it into a public duty. So the court has made it into a moral issue. More than a legal issue, it's a moral issue. Terms of reference of the Mudgal committee never included conflict of interest. The court has made it into a conflict of interest issue. Why? Because it's a PIL. In a PIL, you can go beyond the scope of the terms of reference for the committee. So for the court, and I'm not conjecturing about the judgment, from the perspective of the court, from the observations, it is apparent that for the court, the game of Indian cricket needs to be cleansed. Right. Fans of Indian cricket needs to be protected. And that is why the edifice of the BCCI, which has not been able to protect the cleanliness of Indian cricket, needs to be questioned. That is why the court's verdict is so important and come as a blow to the BCCI.
And Shivani, that possibly throws up the question of another probe panel being formed, does it not?
That is one of the things that did come up in those hearings, because when it was heard in the court during the hearings, that how do we take this forward, what happens from here on, because both parties were at loggerheads. So how do we solve this? At one point, the Supreme Court had asked the BCCI, how do you want to take this forward? And the BCCI had submitted 4 to 5 suggestions, but they had immense reservations to an outside body probing the BCCI. They had even said in court that our autonomy is at stake if an outside committee is made to look into our matters. They were quite okay though with the Mudgal panel itself continuing. The court didn't quite say anything further on this matter, but that is just one of the possibilities, because there are questions in this entire matter which has become extremely messy, and it has so many variants and it has so many strains, that there are questions that are still quite unanswered, like the question of the players and how to take this forward. Maybe the court decides they want more deliberation and they want a committee to come to a conclusion how to reduce this conflict of interest or to strike it down completely. So all of those things could go to another committee, but that is not something that we can say for sure.
Absolutely. Let's remember that the Mudgal panel has been investigating this case for the last 17 months now. The moot question, of course, is whether or not the BCCI is a private body or a public body. We can expect the Supreme Court to address that issue as it pronounces its verdict in a short while from now.